Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Hit subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you never miss out on our latest videos. It's quick, free, and it helps us bring more amazing stories your way. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Mark woke up the next morning to the relentless buzz of his alarm, his mind still swirling with the offer Eleanor had made the night before. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, the weight of his family's struggles pressing down on him. The rain from last night had stopped, but the cold, wet reality of his life hadn't. His mother's medical bills were piling up, and his sister's tuition was long overdue. He had no savings, no backup plan, and no real way out. The idea of marrying a woman he had just met, for business, felt absurd, but he couldn't shake the thought that it might be the only chance he had to get out of this mess. Mark sat up slowly, running his hands through his hair as he tried to make sense of everything. He glanced over at the calendar on the wall. It was almost the end of the month. The payment for his mother's hospital stay was due soon. He needed to make a decision, and fast. He had always been a man of pride, but pride wasn't going to pay the bills. His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his mother. Mark, I don't want to pressure you, but the hospital is asking for a deposit. Please, I'll figure something out. He stared at the screen for a moment, guilt rising in his chest. He had promised his mother that he would take care of her, but he was failing. Failing to keep his promises, failing to provide. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind, I can help. Marry me, and your financial troubles will be over. He got out of bed and paced the small room for a few moments before picking up his phone and dialing Eleanor's number. The line rang a few times before she picked up, her voice as composed as ever. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Eleanor's tone softened, though her voice still carried the calm authority of someone used to getting what they wanted. Mark hung up, his mind still racing. He had made up his mind to meet with her again, but the reality of what he was agreeing to was starting to hit him. Was this really what he wanted? Or was it simply the only way out? The next day, Mark arrived at the sleek, glass building where Eleanor worked. The lobby was filled with polished marble floors, the scent of fresh flowers in the air. He couldn't help but feel out of place, his worn jeans and jacket a stark contrast to the luxurious surroundings. As he waited for the elevator, he thought about how different their worlds were, his small, cramped apartment versus her high-rise office, her life of power and wealth. Was he really ready to enter her world? When the elevator doors opened, he stepped into a quiet, modern office space. Eleanor was standing by the large window, looking out over the city. She turned to face him as he entered, her expression unreadable. Mark nodded, unsure of what to say. The silence between them stretched for a moment before Eleanor motioned for him to sit at the conference table. Eleanor sat down across from him, her gaze never wavering. Mark listened carefully, his eyes flicking between Eleanor and the view of the city outside. Her words were tempting, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. He wasn't sure if he was ready to take such a step, even if it was for his family. But the thought of failing again, of losing everything, was more terrifying than the unknown of this arrangement. He let out a long breath, finally meeting her gaze. Eleanor smiled slightly, the first sign of warmth in her expression. As Mark left her office that day, a strange mix of relief and dread washed over him. He had agreed to marry a woman he barely knew, but at least his family would have a chance. He just hoped he wouldn't regret it. The following morning, Mark stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting the tie he had borrowed from a friend for his meeting with Eleanor. He had never felt so out of place. His reflection stared back at him nervous, unsure, and the reality of what he had agreed to was starting to hit him hard. He had promised himself he would never fall into the trap of easy solutions, but here he was, on the verge of marrying a stranger just to fix his family's financial ruin. He took a deep breath and shook his head, trying to push the doubts aside. There was no turning back now. He had made the decision, and now it was time to follow through. As he stepped into the elevator of the high-rise building where Eleanor's office was located, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The building seemed even more imposing in the daylight, its sleek glass walls reflecting the bright morning sun. The doors opened, and he walked into the lobby, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. He was greeted by a receptionist who directed him to the elevator that would take him up to Eleanor's office. When the doors opened on the top floor, Mark was escorted down a long, polished hallway, the air heavy with the scent of fresh flowers. He couldn't help but feel small, his worn jacket and casual jeans standing in stark contrast to the luxury that surrounded him. As he approached Eleanor's office, he took another deep breath. He had agreed to this, but he still wasn't sure what to expect. Was this all just a business deal, or was there something more? Eleanor was standing by the window when he entered. Her presence was commanding as she gazed out over the city, her posture straight, her expression as unreadable as it had been the night before. Mark nodded, trying to steady his nerves. "You wanted to discuss the terms," he said, his voice sounding more confident than he felt. She gestured to a sleek, modern chair opposite her desk. As Mark sat down, he noticed the well-organized papers in front of her clearly. She was prepared. Everything about her, from her attire to her surroundings, exuded control. Eleanor sat down across from him, her gaze never leaving him. Mark swallowed, still processing her words. "And what does that mean for me?" he asked, his voice edged with uncertainty. Eleanor's expression softened just a touch, but her tone remained firm. Mark's heart clenched at the thought of his mother and sister, both struggling in their own ways. The promise of security felt like a lifeline. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice low but clear. Mark nodded slowly, absorbing her words. The lack of romance made the arrangement feel even more businesslike, but the promise of a better life for his family was hard to ignore. Eleanor's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly, as she continued. "I understand this is a big step, Mark. But you're doing the right thing. This is an opportunity that doesn't come around often. All I ask is that you trust me." Mark was quiet for a moment, his mind racing. He thought about the desperation he had felt just days ago, the weight of his family's struggles, and how, without Eleanor's help, he might lose everything. Finally, he spoke. Eleanor's lips curled into the smallest of smiles, and Mark felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety wash over him. She stood up and extended her hand. Mark took her hand, sealing the deal, even though he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much bigger journey. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, papers, and legal documents. Mark had signed the marriage contract without hesitation, his mind still spinning from the whirlwind of events. Eleanor had arranged everything with the efficiency of someone who was used to having control over every aspect of her life. The marriage was set for the end of the week, and everything seemed to be falling into place. On the day of the ceremony, Mark stood in front of the mirror in the hotel room Eleanor had booked for him, adjusting the tie he had been given for the occasion. He had never felt more out of place in his life. The expensive suit he wore seemed foreign to him, a stark contrast to the worn jeans and shirts he had spent most of his life in. He looked at himself, wondering how he had ended up here, on the verge of marrying a woman he barely knew, just to save his family from financial ruin. He took a deep breath and tried to steady his nerves. He had made the decision, and now there was no turning back. It was all for his family. Eleanor had promised him security, stability, and a future where his mother's medical bills would be paid, where his sister would have the opportunity to go to college. It was all within reach now, but the cost marrying a stranger, living a life that wasn't his own felt heavy. As he made his way to the ceremony room, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread building in his chest. He had tried to convince himself that it was just a formality, that this marriage would be nothing more than a business arrangement. But deep down, he knew that it was more than that. The idea of being tied to someone like Eleanor, someone with so much power, someone who had everything he had ever wanted, was both exhilarating and terrifying. The room was lavish, the walls lined with gold trim, and the large crystal chandelier above them sparkled with light. Mark looked around, feeling a bit dizzy. He was surrounded by people who had wealth, status, and power, things he had never imagined he would be a part of. Eleanor was already at the altar when he walked in, standing tall and composed in a white dress that seemed to fit her perfectly. She looked like she belonged here, like she had always belonged here. Mark felt a pang of insecurity in his chest as he approached her. Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes steady, though there was a flicker of something in them, a hint of warmth or perhaps just anticipation. She held out her hand to him, and Mark took it, feeling the firm, confident grip of a woman who had no doubt about what she was doing. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice calm and reassuring. Mark nodded, trying to muster the confidence he needed. "Ready," he said, though his voice sounded unsteady to his own ears. The ceremony was quick, efficient, and formal. There were no vows of love or promises of forever, just the exchange of rings and the signing of contracts. It was over before Mark could fully process what had just happened. He was now married to Eleanor Brooks, a woman he barely knew, a woman who held the key to his future. As the ceremony ended, Eleanor turned to him with a small smile. "This is just the beginning," she said softly. "You've made the right choice, Mark. And now, we'll begin to build something together." Her words, though kind, still felt like a transaction, a promise of stability in exchange for something far more personal. Mark nodded, but inside, he wasn't sure what to feel. His family would be safe, but what would that mean for him? Was this really the life he wanted? As he followed Eleanor out of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn he wasn't ready for, but there was no going back now. The deal was done, and he was married not just for convenience, but for survival. Mark sat at the large oak desk in his new office, staring at the stacks of paperwork in front of him. The day after the wedding, Eleanor had wasted no time in giving him responsibilities. It wasn't a traditional marriage. There were no romantic dinners or honeymoon plans. Instead, Eleanor had ushered him into the world of business, assigning him to oversee projects that were directly linked to her company's interests. Mark had thought the deal was simply about financial security, but now it felt like he was being pulled into something much bigger. He rubbed his temples, trying to focus on the task at hand. The contract he had signed was clear. His role was to be Eleanor's partner in every sense of the word, at least in the public eye. They were to present themselves as a power couple, sharing the same vision for the future. But the deeper Mark got into the role, the more he realized that his position came with a lot of expectations. As days passed, the routine became clear. Mark spent his mornings in meetings with high-level executives, discussing everything from investment strategies to new business ventures. Eleanor was never far from his mind. She had made it clear that this partnership wasn't about love. It was a business transaction. But the more they interacted, the more Mark began to see sides of her that were unexpected. She was tough, yes, but there was a quiet intensity in her eyes that made him wonder if there was more beneath the surface. One evening, after a long day at the office, Mark found himself in the penthouse apartment he now shared with Eleanor. The apartment was every bit as grand as the office, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city below. But the luxury of it all felt hollow to Mark. It was a world he didn't belong to, a world where every decision was driven by profit, power, and status. Eleanor walked into the living room, a glass of wine in hand. "You look deep in thought," she said, taking a seat across from him. She was always composed, always in control. Mark, on the other hand, felt like a fish out of water. He looked at her for a moment, his thoughts scattered. "I'm just trying to figure out where I fit into all of this," he said, his voice low. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, setting her glass down. "You fit in exactly where you need to, Mark. You've signed the contract, and now you need to start thinking like the man you're supposed to be. You're not here to make friends. You're here to help me build something that lasts. This is what you wanted, isn't it? Mark hesitated. Part of him still couldn't believe how quickly his life had changed. A few weeks ago, he had been struggling to make ends meet. Now, he was in a world where every decision had consequences, where every conversation felt like a negotiation. And yet, as much as he told himself this was just a business arrangement, something about the way Eleanor spoke made him question everything. She wasn't just offering him money and stability, she was offering him a place in her world. And that, in itself, was something Mark couldn't ignore. He leaned back in his chair, staring at her. I never thought it would be like this, he admitted. Eleanor's expression softened for the first time since they had met. I know. But this is the reality we've created together. And you're not alone in it. We're in this as a team. Her words were simple, but the way she said them made Mark feel as though he was being invited into something much larger than himself. A silence settled between them, and for a moment, Mark wondered if there could ever be more to their relationship than just business. But he quickly pushed that thought aside. He wasn't here to fall in love. He was here to make sure his family had a future, no matter the cost. Eleanor's voice broke the silence. You need to trust me, Mark. I didn't bring you into this for you to second-guess everything. You've been given an opportunity that most people could only dream of. Don't waste it. Mark nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. I'm not wasting it, he said quietly. As he watched her leave the room, he felt the strange pull of something deeper than just business. But he wasn't ready to acknowledge it, not yet. He had a role to play, and for now, that was all that mattered. As the weeks passed, Mark began to settle into the rhythm of his new life. The once overwhelming sense of disconnection started to fade as he found himself involved in more projects, attending meetings, and engaging with Eleanor's team. But despite the growing responsibilities, something inside him still felt like it was missing. Eleanor had made it clear from the start that their marriage was a partnership, not a romantic relationship. And yet, as the days went by, Mark couldn't help but notice the subtle moments that kept pulling him closer to her. It wasn't just her beauty or the power she wielded, it was the way she commanded attention in every room she entered. Her confidence was magnetic, but it was something more than that. There was a quiet strength in her, a vulnerability hidden beneath the surface. And every time they spoke, every time their eyes met, Mark felt something stir inside him that he wasn't prepared for. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Mark was heading back to the penthouse when Eleanor called. Mark, are you coming home soon? Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. I have something I want to discuss. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what this was about. It had been a few days since they had spoken about anything personal. Everything between them had been business as usual. When he arrived, the apartment was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the city below. Eleanor was standing by the large window, her back to him as she gazed out at the skyline. She turned when she heard the door open, her expression unreadable. Mark felt his heart race. He had no idea what she was going to say, but something in her voice made him uneasy. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He had known that something was changing between them, but hearing her say it out loud made his heart beat faster. He wasn't sure how to respond. Was this really happening? Mark was silent for a moment, processing her words. He had tried to keep his feelings in check, to remind himself that this was all just a transaction. But now, hearing Eleanor admit that she felt something too, it made it harder to ignore the pull between them. Eleanor's expression softened, and for a brief moment, it felt like the world had stopped. The tension that had been building between them for weeks suddenly seemed to melt away. Mark nodded slowly, his mind spinning. He had never imagined that this marriage, which had started as a lifeline for his family, would turn into something so complicated. But as he looked at Eleanor, he realized that maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk. Eleanor took a step closer to him, and for the first time since they had met, Mark felt the walls between them come down. She reached out and placed her hand on his, her touch warm and gentle. Mark looked at her, his heart racing, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was out of hope. For the first time since their marriage began, he wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: wanted to find out, with her by his side. As they stood there, the city lights twinkling outside, Mark couldn't help but feel that the life he had been so reluctant to embrace was now exactly where he needed to be. The days following their honest conversation felt like a turning point in Mark and Eleanor's relationship. There was no dramatic change, no sudden romantic gestures. Instead, they found a new rhythm. Their partnership, while still rooted in business, had begun to evolve into something more meaningful. Mark started to notice the little things that made Eleanor who she was: her quiet strength, the way she handled difficult situations with grace, and the way she treated people with a surprising level of kindness, even when they weren't looking. But as much as things were shifting between them, Mark knew they still had a long way to go. He had stepped into a world of immense wealth and power, and every decision carried consequences. Eleanor had given him more responsibility within her company, including overseeing a major project that could make or break their future. The stakes had never been higher. One evening, Mark was going over the details of the project when he received a call from Eleanor. "Mark, we need to talk," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "Meet me at the office." He quickly gathered his things and headed out. The sense of unease that had started to build in his chest grew stronger with each step. When he arrived at the office, Eleanor was already there, standing by the large conference table. The mood in the room was tense, and Mark could see that something was off. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Eleanor didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've just received some troubling news. One of our biggest investors is pulling out of the project. They've decided to back out at the last minute, and we're going to lose a significant portion of our funding unless we can find a way to secure it elsewhere." Her words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He had known that the project was important, but he hadn't realized just how much was riding on it. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. "What do we do now?" he asked, his mind racing. Eleanor's gaze softened, and she looked at him like she was considering something important. Mark nodded, the weight of the responsibility settling over him. He had come a long way from the young man who had walked into this world unsure of his place. But now, he wasn't sure if he was ready for what lay ahead. He stayed at the office long into the night, working through numbers and negotiations, making phone calls and sending emails to every potential investor he could think of. But nothing seemed to be working. The pressure was mounting, and he could feel the walls closing in. Just as he was about to give up, his phone rang. It was Eleanor. "Mark," she said, her voice softer this time, "I know this is tough, but I believe in you. I know you can do this. We're in this together, no matter what happens. Don't forget that." Her words gave him a new sense of determination. He took a deep breath and got back to work. By morning, Mark had secured the new investor, saving the project and restoring the company's faith in their vision. He was exhausted but relieved. As he stepped into the conference room, Eleanor was waiting for him, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You did it," she said simply. "You really did it." Mark felt a rush of pride wash over him. It wasn't just about the project or the company, it was about proving to himself that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. As he looked at Eleanor, he realized that they had come a long way from the business arrangement that had started their marriage. Their partnership was no longer just about survival, it was about building something together. Something real. Mark stood in the middle of the lavish office, the same one where he had started his journey months ago. The sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting a soft glow over the city below. It had been a long, exhausting road, but as he glanced at the stack of reports on his desk, he realized something: it wasn't just about business anymore. His partnership with Eleanor had evolved into something more. He was no longer just a man trying to save his family. He had become a key player in her world, her equal, someone who brought value to the table. But despite the success, despite the deals he had helped close and the respect he had earned, Mark knew that something deeper was stirring between him and Eleanor. He had begun to question everything he thought he knew about their arrangement. It was supposed to be a business deal, a partnership built on practicality. But as the months had passed, he found himself drawn to her in ways he couldn't ignore. They had become more than just partners, they had become something more complicated. That evening, after another long day of meetings, Mark returned to the penthouse. Eleanor was already home, her silhouette visible through the large windows as she stood by the balcony, gazing out at the city. She turned when she heard him enter. He nodded, his heart beginning to race. He had felt the tension building between them, but he had been too afraid to acknowledge it. Now, with her invitation, he knew it was time. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his, as though trying to find the right words. "I know we've been through a lot," she began slowly, "and I've always told you that this marriage was about business. But I think we both know it's not just that anymore." She paused, her gaze softening. "I didn't expect to feel this way, Mark. But somewhere along the way, I've started to care about you, more than I thought possible." Mark's breath caught in his throat. He had felt the same way, but hearing her admit it made everything feel more real, more complicated. Eleanor stepped closer, her presence filling the space between them. "I don't want to lose what we have," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "But I also don't want to keep pretending that there's nothing more to this." She reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. Mark looked down at their hands, feeling the connection between them, something that had grown stronger over time, despite their best efforts to keep things professional. He knew that this moment, this revelation, would change everything. Eleanor smiled softly, a flicker of relief in her eyes. "We take it one step at a time. We've built something strong, something real. And if we're ready to explore this, together, then we will. No more hiding, no more pretending. We can make it work, Mark." She squeezed his hand, a silent promise hanging in the air. Mark nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. For the first time, he wasn't just living for his family's survival. He was living for himself, for them, for the future they could build together. The world outside the window seemed to blur as he looked at Eleanor, and for a moment, it felt like everything was finally falling into place. As the weeks passed, Mark and Eleanor's relationship continued to evolve in ways neither of them had expected. They were no longer just business partners bound by an arrangement, something deeper had taken root. It wasn't always easy, but they had found a new dynamic, one built on trust and understanding, and, increasingly, affection. The company was thriving, the projects were flourishing, and Mark had proven himself as an integral part of the team. But what stood out most was the undeniable bond they were forming, something real. One afternoon, after a long meeting with clients, Mark returned to the penthouse, his mind buzzing with thoughts of the future. He had come a long way from the uncertain man who had first stepped into Eleanor's world. Back then, he had only wanted security for his family, but now, he had something. Murray had a life of his own, a sense of purpose, and, perhaps most importantly, he had Eleanor. When he stepped inside, Eleanor was sitting by the window, the soft glow of the sunset illuminating her face. She turned when she heard him enter, and for a moment, they just stood there, looking at each other. There was no need for words. The connection between them was stronger than ever. Eleanor stood up and walked toward him, her expression softening. "I'm glad we found each other, Mark. I've never felt more certain about anything in my life." She paused for a moment, as though choosing her words carefully. Mark's heart swelled with emotion. He reached out and took her hand, holding it gently, as though trying to convey everything he was feeling in that moment. There was a quiet pause as they looked at each other, their hands still intertwined, and in that moment, the weight of their journey together settled around them, a quiet promise of what was to come. Eleanor smiled, a smile that was more than just polite, it was filled with a warmth that reached her eyes. "Then let's keep building. Whatever the future holds, we'll face it together. No more pretending. No more walls between us." She squeezed his hand, a silent vow of her own. Mark nodded, his heart full. He had come into this marriage with no expectations, no real understanding of what he was getting into. But now, as he stood there with Eleanor, he realized that he had everything he needed: someone to love, someone who truly understood him, and a future that was more than just about survival. It was about living. The world outside the penthouse was still, the city lights twinkling like stars in the distance. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to write their own story together. As they stood there, hand in hand, Mark knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side. And that was all that mattered.